Hello everyone and welcome to week 5 of English 121. This week we're going to be talking about setting in short fiction. I'm going to give you a short lecture on how setting occurs and is used by authors in short fiction. Then you're going to be reading 2 excellent short stories this week. The first is called The Storm by Kate Chopin, and that's found on pages 123 to 127 in your textbook literature. You'll also be reading another excellent short story called To Build a Fire, and this is by one of my favorite authors, Jack London, whom I'm a Jack London scholar, so I'm a little partial to him. This is found on pages 127 to 137. Please also read the introductory information on setting, found on pages 120 to 123. So this week we'll also have a conversation about the setting in To Build a Fire and how it's used. And we will, you guys will write a reflection on Kate Chopin's short story, The Storm. It does say here that you'll be attending conferences this week, but I was just informed that I have to be in meetings this week on Friday for faculty, and I will not be able to have the scheduled conferences this week, so I do apologize. I'll give you a little more information about this. Doesn't mean we're not going to have conferences. It means that we will have them, but not until March, so I apologize. Please keep up the active reading, and if you do have questions about it, I hope that you will come see me in my office hours or call me during my office hours so we can discuss it. Alright, so begin by please watching the video in your interactive book about setting. X.J. Kennedy gives a lot of good insight into how setting especially is used in The Storm by Kate Chopin. How Kate Chopin uses the weather as a way to convey the sexual tension between the characters in the story. But setting overall is the time and place when a story takes place. That's the basic meaning of what setting is. But as you'll see in both the stories we're going to read for this week, setting can also refer to weather conditions. And weather conditions really are almost like characters in both of the stories that we're going to be reading, because they're such a vital force in these stories. There's a lot of different things that you want to think about when you're thinking about setting. One of the stories we're reading, To Build a Fire, is an example of naturalism, and I would really like you guys to look up that term. Just a reminder, there is a glossary, an amazing glossary, at the back of our book. I believe it begins on page, 2052. A little tiny side note, which some of you will think is funny. Right when I got out of grad school, I worked for Dana Gioia, who's one of the editors for this book, and I wrote parts of this glossary. So you would make me feel very good if you actually use the glossary. So if you look it up if you look up historical fiction, for example, in the glossary, we have a great definition that tells us that historical fiction is a type of fiction in which the narrative is set in another time or place. So whenever the author is writing historical fiction, the idea is to really make everything in that environment just as if it were set during that time. One way to think about it is when you watch a historical film, the same thing. Everything is like all the cars will be during, the cars that were found on the road during that era. The same kind of attention to detail is found in the setting of historical fiction. The other thing I'd like you to think about is the definition for naturalism. And the definition for naturalism that's provided in our book is that it's a type of fiction or drama in which the characters are presented as products or victims of environment and heredity. Naturalism is considered an extreme form of realism, and it customarily depicts the social, psychological, and economic milieu of the primary characters. It was first formally developed by French novelist Émile Zola in the 1870s. In promoting naturalism as a theory of animal behavior, Zola urged the modeling of naturalist literature and drama on the scientific case study. The writer, like the scientist, was to record objective reality with detachment but from the events on stage. With detachment, events on stage should be reproduced with sufficient exactness to demonstrate the strict laws of material causality. And Jack London is considered one of the great naturalist writers in American literature. One thing to think about is, in To Build a Fire, I'd like you to think about how this is an example of naturalism. How does the environment in which the man lives and makes his choices, was the man from the very beginning? One thing to think about is, from the very beginning, was the outcome going to be the same for the man no matter what? Was the outcome going to be the same for the dog no matter what? Because of who the man was and the environment that man was trying to live in. That's one thing to think about is, from the beginning, are things just going to play out a certain way because of the way that the man is, his nature? The other thing you want to think about when you read a story like To Build a Fire is to really think about how cold it is. I know a lot of us in California think about how cold, 30 degrees is, and we're super cold. But when you're talking about negative degrees of this level, it's really a very different environment that this man is living in. So really think about it, and also the amount of wilderness, how remote it is where he is when he's in this situation. So things to think about. Those are really important aspects of naturalism to think about. Also, regional writer. Kate Chopin is thought of as a regional writer. That means she really focused in a lot of her literature, she focused on writing about Louisiana, where she lived. And it's really important to read the biography about Kate Chopin. She was her husband died and left her with 5 kids to raise, and she supported her children by writing. During that time period, a lot of female writers actually were able to make a living selling their stories to magazines. Jack London also wrote during this time period, and he published his stories to magazines, and you can make a decent living that way. But Kate Chopin, the story that you're going to read by Kate Chopin for this week, she did not publish during her lifetime. And I want you to really think about it. It actually wasn't published until 1969 when a collected work of Kate Chopin's work was finally published. So I'd like you to think about that while you're reading it. Why do you think it wasn't published? And how were people's beliefs about sexuality and marriage relations different than they are now? And also, what kind of marriage the characters in the story have. So it's really important to think about. Also, to think about how the storm actually changes the mood and tone of the story, how it controls the story, and why the story is broken into so many different parts and what those parts mean. So please do think about that as you're reading these stories this week. When you think about setting, you want to think about, how does the setting motivate the plot of the story? And does the exterior setting reveal anything about a character's inner reality? I think in the case of both of these stories, the answer to this is yes, and it's something to really think about. How does the setting change as the plot progresses? This is another really important thing to think about when reading these stories. Here's your checklist for the week. As I said, it's really important to keep these checklists. You're going to be using these later in the semester. Beginning next week, I'll be introducing your first writing assignment, which will be a formal paper where you will use all of these different tools that you've been given in these checklists to think about several stories and to write a paper about them. So something to keep in mind. Don't panic. It's not going to be too difficult, but it will be really useful to have these checklists available. So when you think about setting, you want to think, where does the story take place? What does the setting suggest about the characters' lives? Are there significant differences in the setting for different characters? What does this suggest about each character? When does the story take place? Is the time of year or time of day significant? Does the weather play a meaningful role in the story's action? What is the protagonist's relationship to the setting? Does the setting of the story in some way compel the protagonist into action? Does the story's time or place suggest something about the character or the character or the protagonist? Does the change in the setting during the story suggest some internal change in the protagonist? Alright, so for your first assignment this week, you're going to be talking about To Build a Fire, and I have two of my favorite photos of Jack London there on the right. The bottom one was actually taken just a few days before he died. And Jack London died very young. He was just 40 years old. And there's lots more information about his biography here and a link down at the bottom of the page. And if you're interested in Jack London, I have lots more resources available to you, so just let me know. So what I'd like you to do for this week's conversation is to post a prompt by Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. I'm sorry, by Saturday at 11:59 p.m. this coming Saturday. Answer the following questions. Roughly how much of London's story is devoted to describing the setting? What particular details make it memorable? To what extent does setting determine what happens in this story? Now remember, you can use quotations from the story to really support what you're saying. In To Build a Fire, the man is never given a name. What is the effect of his simply being called the man throughout the story? And do you think the story would feel different if he were called by a name? From the evidence London gives us, what stages are involved in the process of freezing to death? What does the story gain from London's detailed account of the man's experience with each successive stage? One thing to do to expand this would be to think about, to look up the actual stages of freezing to death, see if London actually got it right, and try to understand how those stages relate to the story. What are the most serious mistakes the man makes? To what factors do you attribute these errors? Again, use quotations to support what you're saying. And finally, how would the story be different if it were told by the dog? Alright guys, I hope you enjoy this story. I think it's one of the classics of American fiction. For your reflection this week, you're going to be thinking about The Storm by Kate Chopin. There's in our interactive book, at the very end of the story, if you read the story in the interactive book, in the e-text, you'll see a box on the left-hand side of the page at the bottom that says, watch the video. I want you to answer at least 5 of the questions that are asked when you're watching the video. There's 3 tabs, and I'd like you to answer at least 5 of the questions that are posted under reading, interpreting, and writing. Just 5 overall, not 5 of each one. And then if you're interested in getting some extra credit in this class, this story, The Storm, is actually written. It's a connected story. It's a sequel to At the Acadian Ball, which she had written several years before. If you find a copy of the Acadian Ball and you read it, and you write another reflection post where you explain how these short stories are connected and how Chopin uses setting in both texts, you can get extra credit. Or you can find a copy of The Story of an Hour, a very short story by Kate Chopin, and I'd like you to discuss how Chopin uses setting differently in this short story than she does in The Storm. Just to give you the final update on conferences, again, they are postponed this week due to meetings that I have to attend. I would much rather meet with you guys. I'm very sorry, but we will resume conferences in March. Stay tuned for sign-ups. For next week, we're going to be focusing on theme, and we're going to be reading the amazing Flannery O'Connor, and we'll also be reading some wonderful science fiction, so look forward to that. And I will be introducing your first writing assignment. Alright guys, that's it for this week. I hope that you guys are enjoying reading all these amazing stories. Please do check in, give me a call, or stop by my office hours if you have any questions. And I look forward to seeing you online.